Hi everybody. Yesterday I did a Q&A with Andy Benson on the ROS media platform, and the dominant question that is coming from our members that are involved in signature credit recoupment is this. What is the process and how long does it take? So I've decided to put this document together. As you know, I write the technical documents for ecclesia law. And the process that we're going to look at today is the Clifford Protocol, the methodology that I have devised over a number of years that we had a great deal of success with so far, with up until, say, September of 2025, where we had 600 million of signature credit confirmed, that's recoupment credit confirmed by the IRS, until Amy Sanger sabotaged it all, which is, of course, a different story and a different video. But let's have a look at the process and how long does it take, because I think that this is what the overwhelming majority of members want to know. So let's first of all start with, what is signature credit? Well, the living man woman is where the energy is. The living man woman is separate from the birth certificate construct, which sits on the Monopoly Board of Commerce. So the living man woman is off the board and the birth certificate construct is on the Monopoly Board of Commerce. Now, every time the birth certificate construct gets involved in a bank payment, getting a mortgage, a loan, a credit card, or that entity, that construct, is basically going to conduct some commerce by issuing a negotiable instrument, which is a security, a promise to pay in the future. Then that promise to pay in the future, that security, which the certificate construct has created, via the signature. So that's why it's called signature credit recoupment, because the signature creates the credit. This is confirmed by Professor Richard Werner in his various papers that he wrote after 16 years of empirical study, and also by the Bank of England in their paper from 2014, which is money in the modern economy. So there's plenty of research to back up that the signature creates the credit, and the credit then is converted into currency. So if you are not clear on how the whole process works, I recommend you read my documents on the Ecclesia Law Institute under recoupment, and you also have a look at the various webinars I've presented and the Q&As that you can access on the ROS media platform. So basically what is going on here is that on the Monopoly Board it's all artificial, and the energy of the living man woman is transferred to the Monopoly Board. That's where all the artificial constructs are operating, and everything on that Monopoly Board is bankrupt because of House Joint Resolution 192. Everything on the Monopoly Board, which is a worldwide Monopoly Board of Commerce, is operating in Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So you have the credit, which is being created by the signature of the living man woman through the birth certificate construct, and that birth certificate construct is a banker. If you look at the Bills of Exchange Act of 1882, it tells you in there that a body of persons is a banker. So the birth certificate construct, which of course isn't new, it's a construct, it's artificial, is issuing signature credit all the time. Bank payments, creating mortgages, creating loans, credit cards, and any other creation or promise to pay, even if it's a deduction from, say, PAYE or some kind of W-2 tax deduction. That deduction is a payment, a promise to pay in the future. So everything that is going on the Monopoly Board, if you look at world debt, whatever that value is, if you look at the world debt clock, I think it's around, so they're reporting about $80 trillion. I think it's a lot higher than that if you add derivatives in. All of that world debt is energy. it is the transfer of the living man woman's energy onto the monopoly board, and that transference of energy is done through the birth certificate construct, as the banker under the Bills of Exchange Act 1882 confirmed there. And then what happens is that the banks are operating as nominees, and they're going to use that credit. They're going to treat that credit as a deposit. So your signature, that when you make a bank payment, when you create a mortgage loan, credit card, anything that you're doing on the Monopoly Board of Commerce creates a promise, this energy transference, which is a promise to pay in the future. And the banks that are operating as nominees means fiduciaries, are going to take that promise to pay as if it were a deposit. So if you ask bankers, how do you lend money out to your customers? They say, we take in deposits and we lend them out. Well, the deposits they take in is the signature credit that comes from the living man woman, which is the energy that is being put onto the monopoly board. Well, after the energy's gone onto the monopoly board, at the beginning of the process, the clearing banks will then sell the signature energy in securitizations to the investment banks. And the investment banks are operating in New York, in Wall Street, pretty much. And those investment banks then are basically, they are paying an annual tax for the use of the living man woman's energy. So if you've made a bank payment, created a mortgage loan or credit card, what's really going on is that your energy is being used by the banks as nominees. And if you look into the IRS publication 1212, it talks all about nominees, because the nominee is basically a fiduciary for the true creditor. So the true creditor, the true owner of the credit, the true holder in due course is the living man or woman. But the living man or woman can't go on to the monopoly board because it's an artificial board. You can't operate on the artificial monopoly board if you're living. You can only operate on there if the entity is an artificial construct. So that's why everything on the Monopoly Board of Commerce is artificial. And if you try and recoup by using the birth certificate construct to recoup abandoned credit, you're going to get into serious trouble, potentially, because the artificial construct of the birth certificate is a debtor. It's not a creditor. It's not the holder in due course of the credit, because the holder in due course, the originator, the true creditor, is the living man woman, who's never going to be on an artificial monopoly board. So the way to recoup the abandoned credit is to create a nominee structure, a proxy for the living man or woman. That nominee structure is a grantor trust, which sits on the monopoly board as the holder in due course of the abandoned credit, the signature credit that's been transferred onto the monopoly board from the living man woman through the birth certificate construct. And then the banks are using that abandoned signature credit, and they are using it. It's called hypothecation. I've gone into it in great detail on my Q&As and on my webinars. And the investment banks who are now using the signature credit energy, they pay taxes to the United States Treasury every year for the use of your energy. That's as simple as I can make it. And those taxes is what you can recoup. Now you can recoup it via your international grantor trust, which is now the true nominee and holder in due course, the true creditor to the abandoned signature credit. The beneficiary of that grantor trust, of course, is the living man or woman, who really is the true creditor, but the man or woman can't step onto the artificial board, so they've got to use a proxy, got to use a nominee, and that nominee is the grantor trust that is established to file the tax returns, to correct the record at the United States Treasury through nominee correction, exactly in compliance with IRS publication 1212. So what's going on here is that you are, if you're doing this process, you are recouping the taxes that are being paid by the investment banks, the nominees. They presume to be the the holder in due course of the abandoned credit. Of course, they're not, because the credit belongs to the living man or woman. But the living man or woman can't step on the monopoly board without putting a proxy on the board to do the tax filing, which is the grantor trust, as that's the proxy they're going to put onto the monopoly board. So once you've got that framework in your mind, then the rest of this document will make sense. You're not recouping the actual security itself. What you're recouping is the equivalent of the securities that you've put onto the monopoly board through the artificial construct of the birth certificate. You're recouping the taxes which the investment banks, which are operating as pseudo holders in due course, they are presuming that they're holders in due course of the credit. What you're actually doing is you're recouping the taxes that the investment banks are paying to the United States Treasury. And you might be thinking, why do the investment banks pay taxes to the United States Treasury? The answer is because the United States Treasury is the bankruptcy trustee for the entire monopoly board, and the investment banks are paying taxes because they're paying the trustee in bankruptcy, which is the United States Treasury, for the use of the credit that actually belongs to every living man or woman who's put their energy onto the monopoly board. That 80 trillion of world debt, if that's currently what the world debt clock is saying, that is energy that is all owed back to the living man or woman. So that's kind of a summary of how the Clifford Protocol very, very high level works. And now let's take a look at the IRS's process. What the IRS does, as it says on the screen here, is they have an algorithmic system where they track and trace all of that abandoned signature credit. Where does it come from? Who does it belong to? They know all these things in their computer system, and they want to match it. So what we do is we have a process which tracks the origination of the signature credit, which tracks which securities the signature credit is sitting in, which tracks which investment bank is controlling that securitization, which investment bank is paying the taxes to the United States Treasury. And that is on this form here, this form 945, tax transcript. So that is the investment banks paying taxes under their tax module 945. Now, everything that is happening here is governed by this 810 algorithm. So the IRS has this algorithm called the 810 algorithm where they check it all out. And if it ticks all the right boxes, then it gets through the algorithm and it should move through the process quite quickly. But if there is any issues with the 810 algorithm, it will be frozen. There'll be a refund freeze. And then what can you do to freeze that? I'm going to go through that. And everything that your rights to, if you're doing abandoned credit recoupment, you have a right to it. Your grantor trust has a right to it because it is the true holder in due course, it's representing the true creditor, i.e. the living man, woman as the beneficiary of the grantor trust. Under this 26 USC 7422, you have a right, or the grantor trust has a right to force the United States Treasury to pay out the recoupment. So this is the process again, the origination under the Bills of Exchange Act 1882, the monetization, that's the signature that creates the credit, that living man's signature. The nominee, that's the bank that takes in that deposit, is then going to sell that securitization to a securitization vehicle operated principally in New York by an investment bank. That's the CUSIP number, that is a reference number for the security that's holding that abandoned signature credit. And then the IRS is going to check it all out and make sure that there's sufficient taxes being paid by the investment bank on their Form 945 tax module is equal to or greater than the amount of recoupment that your grantor trust is seeking to receive. It's all explained in IRS publication 1212, the nominees, how it's all reported, what 1099 OID is all about. I'm not going to go through it in a great deal of detail. Financial rights and holder in due course. It's all about the holder in due course. Now, the grantor trust that you've set up to do the filings is now treated as the holder in due course of the credit, representing the underlying beneficiary, which is a living man or woman. That's the true creditor, but remember, the true creditor can't step onto the monopoly board, so the grantor trust is now operating as the holder in due course, as a proxy or nominee for the true creditor, which is the living man or woman that transferred their energy onto the monopoly board. We use a 98 series international grantor trust as the proxy. You don't have to use a grantor trust, but in my opinion, it's the most efficient way of doing it. And that isn't just a piece of paper with a trust document. It has its own tax reference number. The IRS knows what it is because it has its own tax reference number, and they know it's a grantor trust, which is critically important. The grantor is the birth certificate construct, and the beneficiary is the living man or woman. That's the separation of what's called the split title between the living man and woman, who's the beneficiary, who can't step on the monopoly board, and the grantor operating as the birth certificate construct. And the trustee of this grantor trust is Ecclesia Trustees, as a professional trust company. Now, in order to file the 1099 OID to correct the record, that is done by a licensed, it's called an ERO, an electronic reporting officer. So you've got to have a license from the IRS to make these filings. You can't just file bits of paper or just grab hold of a piece of software and file. You have to have a license to file these types of tax returns, and you have to be professionally qualified with a license to do so. And of course, an ERO isn't going to file under this process unless it was completely lawful. So then the next thing is you've got what happens if the IRS 810 algorithm looks at the taxpayers, that's the investment bank's 945 tax modules, and there's not enough taxes on there it's insufficient, the amount of tax, to cover all of our members' grantor trust recoupment. So let's say there was 100 members and they all wanted to file with Morgan Stanley as the taxpayer, under their 945 tax return. If there was 100 members looking to recoup their recoupments from Morgan Stanley as the taxpayer, and the amount of the membership's recoupment was greater than the amount that Morgan Stanley, as the nominee, the presumed nominee for the credit, the presumed holder in due course, then what would have to happen is that taxes that Morgan Stanley had paid on other tax modules would be moved over to the 945 tax module, so that the 945 tax module has sufficient in it to fund the 100 members that are trying to recoup from that particular taxpayer. And that is called a cross-modular transfer. And it satisfies the 810 algorithm, and then the recoupment can carry on. But let's suppose that let's actually, before we get into what happens if the IRS block it for some reason, and what recourse does the grantor trust have, this is the 945 taxes paid. This is the module 945 from 23 to 25. The average of those years, three years, 294 million, as you can see, 881 million, 336 million, an average of 514 million has been paid by the investment banks under their 945. So if the amount of our membership's recoupments exceeds 514 million as an average per year, which it will do by quite some amount, then we need to do cross-modular transfers. And our IRS call team would be calling the IRS to command them to move taxes onto the taxpayer's 945 tax modules from other modules. So what are these other modules? Well, investment banks pay a lot of taxes, and as you can see here, JP Morgan I think this is in 1 year, paid 37.16 billion in taxes. So that gives you an idea of how big they are. HSBC 13.1, Freddie Mac 7.86, these are billions, these are millions. You can add it all in taxes. It's being paid by the investment banks, and that pretty much is the ceiling for how much credit can be recouped. So if you were to divide the amount of our members by the amount of taxes paid by the nominees, if there's 60 billion and each of our members was recouping $600,000 a year, that means that we've got a maximum membership of about 100,000 members, which is perfectly fine for my vision, because as you know, I want to create our freedom plan, our own community and a sovereign nation. Well, having 100,000 members who are all doing annual recoupments would be sufficient for that vision and the creation of the freedom plan. And of course the freedom plan is financed through the Old Souls Nation, which is a foundation which will get a minimum of 20% of the recoupment. So if we're recouping 60 billion, then there is 12 billion or thereabouts a year which goes into the budget for the Old Souls Nation to finance the freedom plan. Should be more than enough to finance that nation. It will become a sovereign nation with all of its own infrastructure. And about 100,000 members would be the ceiling. So what happens if there is a block by the IRS? If they block the recoupment for some reason, for some obscure reason? Well, I'm going to cover that in a moment, because I think the question that everybody wants to know about is how long does it take? Well, this table here is with a fair wind and without there being any wars and without there being any IRS close downs, this is how long it would take. About 4 to 6 months from start to finish, if you look through each of these 6 steps. Now also what we've done is we've created the banking facilities. So investment banks are making the payments to the IRS. The IRS receives those tax payments, and the IRS, US Department of Treasury, then pays the grantor trust. That's the one that's done the tax filing under 1099 OID through the electronic filing officer with the license to file the Clifford Protocol. And then there's a bank which has a network of accounts, trust accounts, master and sub accounts. So your nominated grantor trust will receive funds from the United States Treasury through either a Fedwire transfer if it's over $1 million, or if it's under $1 million, through an ACH transfer. It's automatically paid into your grantor trust bank account, and then from there it's transferred to your Asset Fortress Protocol, which is why all of our members need the Asset Fortress Protocol, which of course is the private treasury which you're going to be using for spending and recouping going forward, those spend and recoup cycles that I've spoken about on my webinars. Now, the deduction that is going to finance the Old Souls Nation isn't actually coming at a cost, because we'll engineer it in such a way where the amount of the deduction, that 20% share as a minimum, is actually recouped back to the Asset Fortress Protocol. So there actually isn't any cost at all for the Republic of Old Souls envoys and members that are who are following the Clifford Protocol and recouping their signature abandoned credit. So that's the master and sub accounts set up with top tier banks in the United States who've agreed to do this. Obviously they've looked at it in great detail and they're happy to do it. This is the triage that they are looking at. This is what they call the triage, the ACH and Fedwire from the United States Treasury straight to a bank that's offering an account for each of the tax filing grantor trusts. Now what happens if the IRS blocks the transfer? Well, what can happen then is that under the 810 algorithm, it may for some reason block it. It shouldn't do. If we've done our homework correctly, if we've correctly identified where the signature credit is, which security it's in, and we've made sure that there's enough credit on the taxpayer, that's the investment bank's 945 tax module, then if there were a block for some reason, which I'm not expecting, but just suppose there was, then the grantor trust can file with the United States, against the United States Treasury, a 26 USC 7422. And ecclesial law would do all those filings for the members, grantor trusts. And so under this 26 USC 7422, that is the right for the recoupment. And there's various others. This is to do with the timing. So there's a 6-month rule. There's a statute of limitations. You've got 2 years to make the filing. Of course, we wouldn't wait for 2 years. And it should be resolved within 6 months. And this is the process to make a 7422 claim. Basically, it could take 6 months or more to get the claim paid out. So if you look at the entire process, it could take 4 to 6 months with a fair wind if there's no issues. If there are issues, it could take another 6 months. It might push it out to a year plus, but there shouldn't really be any other issues. I hope this has answered the questions that a lot of people have been asking. This is a perfectly lawful process. It's taken me a long time to join all the dots up and build all the infrastructure. We're able to service about 100,000 recoupments a year. That's our ceiling. If you haven't started doing abandoned credit recoupment, I can assure you that when people get their head round it and start to see more and more results coming in off the back of the results we've already had, there's going to be an absolute flood of people wanting to do it. So if you are interested in going down this pathway, recouping your signature credit, your abandoned signature credit, I urge you to start as soon as you can. Thanks for watching.